is a senior researcher at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs in the US. And in fact, in the past, she gathered her experience at many different institutions. So she was also associate professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She was research affiliate at the Population Research Center of the University of Chicago. She was teaching at the Ohio State University, at the University in Barcelona, and she got her PhD from the Boston University. And Alicia is an economic demographer, and actually I think she is best known for her research on the effects of the labor market and labor market institutions on fertility. It's at least how I perceive her, but she is also very much interested in migration and its various aspects, such as immigrant fertility or, for instance, the well-being of child migrants. So Alicia, I'm very, very happy that you accepted our invitation and that you will share your research with us. And the topic Alicia will be presenting, oh, I'm sorry, I have to
find the title.
You can say yourself. I lost it.
Well, I titled it, Do Cohabiters Work and Earn Like Married or Single Individuals? A little bit comparing cohabiters in the labor market to married and single. That's what I
Oh, please, the floor is
more of an economic types of paper, sort by demographic. It's
yes.
Okay. So let me just share this.
You can share.
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen. Let me edit from the start. Oopsie. Here we go. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to show you lots of numbers. Some of these things are a little bit, still I'm trying to make sense of what am I learning on these numbers. So, you know, it would be nice to have a Q&A and discussion, which I think is something that Anna told me that we were going to be able to do later. Sorry, I moved this. I didn't want to move it. Okay. This is part of a larger project that we are working with Federica Querin. Federica graduated last year from Princeton. She's also an economic demographer, and she's now at the European University Institute. And so this is like a first piece of this research. So what are we going to try to do here, and what is the goal of the paper? So the motivation is very natural, especially if since many of you are going to be economists or demographers, is a no-brainer. We know that couples compared to single individuals receive consumption-related gains. So when you enter in a couple and people are looking at household bargaining or deciding on marriage, we know they are public goods, you know, common goods that are produced in the household that are an advantage for being in a couple, that people are pulling risk by being a couple. And also at the same time, they're going to engage in intra-household specialization in the same way that we're thinking of intercountry trade in terms of comparative advantage. The argument was made that there was some type of comparative advantage for men and women that led to intra-household specialization. Of course, there's a big debate nowadays on what is this intra-household specialization in terms of comparative advantage, as the types of labor market opportunities of women have increased, as the types of labor market occupations have changed, and they may, for example, don't change as much the comparative advantage of women in terms of, for example, the use of physical effort as opposed to, you know, the brains or other types of skills, that maybe the gap is not the same as it used to be when we're thinking about the 19th century. Okay, so this is one end of the motivation. The other end of the motivation of thinking about it is that who enters marriage may be not the same as who does not enter marriage. So there may be selection across marital status, and there must be selection on who chooses to cohabit versus who chooses to marry, or whether this is actually a choice or not on how people eventually enter on those relationships. So this is basically the two things that we have to think about. And then in fact, the numbers I'm going to show you at the end, there's a bit of a discussion. What do you learn from one or the other? And it's not clear, because it's not a clean exercise to say, well, this is what I know about the specialization, this is what I know about selection. But there's some suggestive findings that we can think about. So the goal of this project is to compare the men's and women's changes in the labor market effort and their financial status when they enter unions. Either it's a cohabitant union or a marriage. So when they do this change, do they increase in their income? Do they change the effort in the labor market? What's going on? And also we want to look at, in that sense, the relative contributions of adjustments in their own income, in income pooling, and in changes in family size. Because the change in household income may come from an increase in effort of both members, or it may come from a specialization that leads to an overall pooling of income and not necessarily an increase in individual income from one of the members of the new unit. In this paper, we are using, the one I'm going to show you is the old ECHP data. We're using it precisely because it's a time where still cohabitation was not very prevalent, and we can really think about more, this selection and this difference across the countries. And we are working, starting with USILC, to do the same type of exercise. So what are some general facts that we know about cohabitation versus marriage? Well, we know that in general, the literature, and this is, I'm already citing older papers, married men earn more than single men and cohabitant men. So there's this marriage premium, okay? But some of the recent data is showing already an evidence of reduction, which may be related, for example, to the selection of who is going to marry and who's going to cohabit, or to other opportunities in the labor market changing. Another fact that we observe is that the number of children explains a part of the gap for women in terms of the earnings, and not that much for men. So when you really observe effort or income, children are important for women. And also some people say, well, if you're comparing across countries, this is not going to be the same within the different systems or different countries, because there are going to be things as marriage penalties, so tax regulations, among other things. This is just an example that are going to affect the difference between cohabitants and married people and their labor market outcomes, which is what we are looking at. So when I'm thinking about how do I analyze the differences of these observed gaps, so the fact that men earn more and women earn less and children explain the difference, which are the pathways that lead to that? Well, I can think, for example, that the reason that I get differences between cohabitation and marriage, and also between cohabitation, marriage versus no union, is a matter of specialization. Okay, so that's the natural thing. That's the comparative advantage story I was telling you about. So when we observe this data, we can say, well, maybe within a marriage, men specialize in labor market skills. And it's very difficult to really establish any causal relation on that. There are some people, there's a nice paper on Ginther Sundström on Rolhun, I don't know how to pronounce his name, on changes on the regulation of marriage in Sweden, and looking at whether these triggers on marriage that wouldn't have occurred before and then led to differences in the specialization that they argue were causal, and actually they find some increases in specialization. So are these increases in specialization causal because of the marriage, or in any case, we just observe them? Another reason that we may lead to a specialization, it may be also how people perceive the union. So when you're comparing between marriage and cohabitation, maybe if people perceive that the particular union they are in, especially in cohabiting couples, is less stable, maybe they are going to be less likely to pool their income, and as the result also they are going to be less likely to specialize. I mean, that's, for example, a clear example that in the literature, there are papers looking at when divorce laws change, women, some cases, change their labor market effort as a, backup, or as an insurance to have some possibility of going into the labor market in case this divorce happens. Well, the same logic will happen here. Maybe specialization is less if unions are perceived to be less stable as marriages. On the other hand, the literature shows that the birth of a child increases the salience of specialization, and especially also the likelihood of a marriage. Is increasing the salience of specialization because now there's more conflict over the hours. So the women need to put some of these hours because they were the ones who delivered, or men, depending on whether there's a good system in the country implemented that gives you parental leave for the side of men. But in any case, that may lead to temporary more salience in specialization. And also they may lead to more marriage in this case. That's the argument, for example, by some economists like Lunger, Pollack, and others, arguing that, among the most educated, there's a big gradient into going into a marriage at the birth of the child, because that's the one that ensures more long-term investments. And in that case, we should observe maybe those specializations coming hand in hand with marriage, because this is going to be the place where people are thinking they're going to have children. Okay. In terms of hours of housework, it goes in the other direction. We observe in the literature a smaller gap in hours of housework among cohabitants than among married. So clearly, even within the household, cohabitants specialize less. But the time spent with children is more or less the same. So this will go for the specialization. So what will be the other pathway that may lead to differences between cohabitation versus marriage? Well, the second pathway will be who cohabits and who marries. Okay, so one thing will be, once you enter that union, you specialize differentially, but other maybe question is who enters those unions. So who moves into marriage versus cohabitation may explain those observed differences in income and effort that I'm going to show you now. And so why? Well, one first reason may be that the degree of selection may depend on the meaning of cohabitation in each context. And that may be context-based, and that may be time-based. So that's why, for example, I was telling you at the beginning, I'm interested in looking at, this old European data and comparing what's going to happen now, because I think that has changed, because the meaning of cohabitation has changed over the last 20 years. So we know that cohabitation may be considered a trial period, may be considered for some people similar to marriage because they don't just one paper and they consider exactly the same thing. Or in other cases, it may be just an inability to marry. We have all this large literature, especially in the US, of the unmarriageable men, coming from Sarah McLana, David Rudd, other people. And some people who have looked at the shocks, for example, David Otto has a nice paper looking at shocks coming from China, affecting particular low-educated, low-skilled men in the US, and related to that, a very much lower likelihood to marriage, so decreasing marriages among those groups. The degree of selection may also depend on the educational gradient in cohabitation that vary across these countries. So what will be the impact of selection on how we should be observing that in the data? So if we think selection is important, when we observe men, maybe we should observe that men with more potential, more attractive in the marriage market, are going to be the ones who marry more. So when we observe that suddenly the guys who are married has higher income, there's going to be confounding issues, because we can actually see that those people who marry are precisely those who have much higher income. It's not that marriage per se leads causally to a change in income or in effort. It's just a selection into that marriage for the characteristics of that particular person. Individual effects should account for some of these unobservables that we cannot really see in terms of this attractiveness of this potential. And so we could see, following people across time, whether the same people, the moment they enter the marriage, they actually change their effort in the labor market, they change their income. And in that case, we could really reach a more causal relationship of what the entering in the union is, clinging part of the selection. So but still always thinking that it's not completely the solution. So what do we know about this? Well, we know there's papers like McDonald in 2020 showing selection is very important for the male marriage premium, and also productivity increases and employers' discrimination related to that marriage premium. Ong and Wan show that women select higher income men on an online dating sites in an experiment in China. I'm working now with a group of people that we are studying family formation in Southern Europe and in East Asia. And I can tell you, looking at the data from the Japanese, having a spouse who's going to have stock in the big exchanges and to work in a company that is listed as among one of the top in the stock exchange is one of the goals, or is one of the big things. So actually getting a good potentially attractive guy is an important thing into that literature. So the thing is, could increases in income lead to a higher chance to transit to partnership or marriage? So when we observe these things coming together, what leads to what? And then I will talk a little bit about the timing. And then for women with more earnings potential, this is a bit of question mark. On one end, they may be able to find a better match, but also on the other end, they may be willing to postpone marrying because they may be willing to, before marrying, gain experience and attain high income prospects. So all these are the theories that we have behind, and that already tell us what should we expecting on the data. But as I said, it's going to be very difficult to tease out what are the driving mechanisms behind. So what are we going to do in this paper? Oh, finally, an important issue. Since here we're going to be showing you data of 14 countries, we think cross-country variation matters. And in what end is it going to matter here? Well, in the data that I have, cohabitation is very different across those countries. Depending on how prevalent cohabitation, that may lead to having these people being more or less selected, and also maybe potentially for people entering those unions, perceiving those unions to be more or less stable. If this is something completely unusual and it's starting, people may perceive them as less stable. If social norms already in a particular country are such that cohabitation is thought to be almost similar to a marriage or a precursor of marriage, then they are not thought to be as unstable, for example. So early research, for example, show unions more stable in the US, but not as much in Denmark, precisely because prevalence at that point was very different in some types of, in one country compared to the other. And so by itself, maybe depending on the prevalence of the country, we should expect more or less specialization for the argument I was giving you before, okay? Cross-country prevalence may also be affected by labor market institutions, which in fact are very correlated with this prevalence. And you know, the data I'm going to show you across prevalence applies mostly across big areas of South, North Europe, so on and so forth, okay? Which is the data that I'm going to use in this paper. This is the 1994-2001 waves of the European Community Household Panel. So this is old data, but interesting data in the sense that it's the beginning of cohabitation in some places. We are not including Sweden because Sweden doesn't have a proper panel structure, and we are interested in following people. We are going to be interested in looking at the changes within people. And so Sweden was not really a good data in there. The individuals we have are people between 20 and 50 years old, and we are using this age range because we want to avoid some issues of retirement. We don't want to get too late into the game so that people have early retirements and the drops that we are getting in income or effort are related to some of these things. The data that we are going to, the sample we're going to construct are people who are single or in their observed first union or marriage. So we don't have any widow, any divorce, or any separated. And if this happens, these people are basically dropped. I'm just looking at people who are moving from single to married, single to cohabit, cohabit to married, or staying in those states. A couple of big shortcomings of this data. So a first shortcoming of the data is this is annual. Okay. What's the problem with annual is I don't really have the month of when things happen. And then if they are very short cohabitations or marriages spells, I'm going to miss those, okay? The results will be unrepresentative if those relationships are very important by the duration. So if the relationship between marital status and income varied systematically with very short duration, that will be a problem. I'm not sure there's going to be such a big share of marriages or cohabitations that I'm going to miss in this case. And that's as much as we can say. We hope that this is not very important in terms of the bias. And then the other problem is we don't have the month or union of marriage. And that means that, of course, we don't know whether somebody married early or late in the year. And well, since we are counting the overall income change or the overall effort change within a year, this is always going to be an issue depending on whether the distribution of the marriages or changes in cohabitations are skewed into the early or late part of the year, and we don't know that. And of course, we are going to experiment a bit with the year before, but that's as much as we can do. So, you know, every data set has its shortcomings. The models that we are going to run, and that I'm going to show you, are going to be of two types. So one type of model is going to be a very basic log level, and I'm going to have differences. I'm going to have the outcome that I'm going to show you which outcome we're going to look at. And then I'm going to see whether people who are in marriage or cohabitant relationships are different from single. And this is going to be just a level effect, okay? And then I'm going to do changes. So I'm going to look at these individuals, and what I'm going to be looking at is the change from one year to the other in the effort, the income, and all these things I'm going to show you, related to the fact that these people move from single to marriage, from cohabiting to marriage, or from cohabiting, from single to cohabiting. So I'm going to have these three transitions: from single to cohabit, single to marriage, or cohabiting to marriage. And I want to see whether there was a change in effort or income or so on and so forth. Okay. Of course, the shortcoming is that I'm not really tracking whether this change is something that continues to happen thereafter. At this point, I'm just in a lower bound, if you may, just looking at was there a change at this point in this year. I could, of course, estimate something just going more forward. The problem is we have very few years in terms of the panel, and it's very hard to really get anything meaningful in that sense. What outcomes I'm going to measure? I'm going to measure the hours people work. I'm going to measure how much is their annual working earnings, so the work earnings that they get. Then also the total income, and the total income includes work transfers, capital income, and employment benefits, any income that they are getting from anywhere. And then I'm going to be interested in the unit itself, so the total household income. And in this case, an important thing, and this is just to bear in mind because of the results I'm going to show you, I'm taking into account all the income of all the members of the household, okay? Work earnings, capital, income transfers, and of everybody who is considered to be the household unit. So in the European household panel, they will ask you who is called household unit, just list the people, and everybody who's there, it's pulled there as household income. So it's not just the spouses, it's everybody, okay? So you are moving from a unit household income with a certain amount of income to another. And finally, because I want to correct for composition, I'm going to use some adult equivalent household incomes. It's not the same thing as if you have in a household income everybody who's an adult of working age, as if you have many kids. And so there are different ways to take into account this adult equivalent. So there's the OECD scale, there's a modified one, and also the very rough saying, okay, per capita, which is the per capita household income, which assumes that there are no economies of scale or no age-specific difference in consumption. I'm going to show you some results with this one, which I think is the more reasonable one. There's some, economies of scale, an idea that maybe the kids don't consume as much as older people or some different. Okay, this is some descriptives of my data. So the first column is the single, cohabiting, and married. So not surprising, if I go to things like total individual income, I'm going to get that single men, and this is in logs, make less than cohabiting and married men. And on average, on my sample, married men make a little bit more. In terms of women, the ones who make the most are the cohabiting, and married women make more or less the same on average on my sample as the ones who are single. In terms of children, for sure, women who are married are the ones who have on average the more kids compared to number of children for single. And hours work, there's a clear drop. So in here for women, you have this number on average for single, some increase in cohabiting and a decrease compared for married. For men, it increases until the highest number of effort or the hours are in married. So larger for women income cohabit, larger hours work in cohabit, more children in the married. Okay. The other variable is I'm going to look at countries by the prevalence in the sample of how much cohabitation. This is the raw number on the sample by this country. So I'm going to group countries in 3 groups. In one table I'm going to show you. I'm going to consider countries that at that point they had very low cohabitation. So you can imagine how much things have changed. So Spain at that point we only had 2%, medium cohabitation, and then high cohabitation. Interestingly, if I were to look at that geographically, I would mostly get the same thing, because this is basically Southern Europe and Ireland. So when I group it by the traditional types of labor market institutions, they are almost the same results, except I have to take Ireland in here, but it's not very different in terms of the grouping. Okay, so let me start by showing you some of these tables, and let's think about what we find out, and I will be very happy to then discuss what do you think of these things. So let's first think about household income. So when these people are getting together, is their household income increasing or not? Well, as you're going to see, it depends on whether we are counting it total or adult equivalent, interestingly. So this will be what you're seeing here. Let me walk you through that. This will be the second type of model. So what I have here is the change, the dependent variable will be the change in total household income. So how much total household income change if in that period I move from single to married, or in that period I move from single to cohabit, or in that period I move from cohabit to married. Okay, so this is just the same year change. So I'm moving to this new marital status, how much compared to everybody else, the total household income is changing. Well, you observe that there's not much change. There's a bit more in the single to cohabit, but interestingly, not super huge change from single to married. And the difference is basically there's no difference between men and women, because normally what's happening is they're moving together on average. Okay, so the data should be similar. So the puzzle is why there's not such a big change. And the first thing I wanted to look at is there a big difference depending on the countries we're looking at? So this is by the cohabitation prevalence. So this is for women. So the first column is what I just showed you. This is the change in total household income when I move from one transition on marital status or other. And then I'm going to divide the sample in 3 groups. These are places, basically Southern Europe with Ireland, where the prevalence of the cohabitation was super low. This is medium, and this is high. People cohabit. Okay. It's very interesting because, in fact, what you're observing is that total household income in places with low prevalence of cohabitation, if anything, they decrease or they do not change. So if I'm moving out, what will be moving out? Just think about that time, Southern Europe, Italy, Spain. These guys are moving out of their house, of their parental house. So they are moving from a parental house into somebody else's house, which is going to be their house. And they become poorer to some extent in some cases. So they're going to be moving single to cohabit, even that total household income is going to drop. In high prevalence, this is not going to be the case because they maybe were already living with somebody else, other young people or their own, before moving into a union. And so it's a very different pathway into how you're moving into the household composition where you come from is very different. Okay. And so that's a very interesting first result. If I go for that across for men, is exactly the same. Okay, so that's the first thing we learn. No change or drop if prevalence is low, increase if high, and the men is the same. So why do they move together? Okay, so they move together because they're in love, they want to be together, and they're forming a new household. But when I actually go and look at adult equivalent, actually they're making an improvement, and that's the interesting thing. If I don't look at just the total household income, but I take into account the composition of the household, actually there's an improvement in their adult household equivalent income. They are increasing when they move to single to married. So that's telling me they are coming from larger households. Well, maybe they are pulling income, the mother, the father, maybe another sibling, and then they're moving to their own household. When you move it to adult equivalent, there's a change into some of this increase in the income. So one thing we need to take into account when we're thinking about these transitions across countries is that the composition of the household where people depart from is not the same. Okay, so I look at that from prevalence, and interestingly, in places where the prevalence in Southern Europe, the increase in terms of household equivalent is much larger, whereas it was decreasing in terms of total income, it's increasing in terms of adult equivalent household income, because the households shrink and they have a different composition. So summing up, so far, no large change in household income total when moving to a union, larger in high prevalence countries, even if a slight decrease in low prevalence countries, and increases in adult equivalent household income for all. So now let's go to individual. Now we know what happened when you move as a total. So what happens for men and women individually when they are moving into these households? I'm going to show you the income, controlling or not for effort, and then I will focus on effort, which is going to be hours of work, okay? And I want to know these are 2 different things to some extent. So the first thing I'm going to show you is this change in total income associated with the transition for marital status. Okay. So the first column is just basically levels. This is telling me that on average, a married woman individually has lower income than a single woman, and a cohabiting woman has on average similar income than a single woman. And for men, it's telling me on levels on average, a married man has higher individual income than a cohabiting man, and for sure than a single man. So the ranking is naturally appearing. What about the change? Well, when I'm moving into single from married, there's a big drop in individual income for women. And there's not such a huge change in men, which is very interesting. And that's a little bit of a puzzle. It has to do with maybe specialization. But there's a drop in cohabiting, but not as much. And there's a big drop for women also when they move from cohabit to then deciding to marry in that relationship that they were cohabiting. Our puzzling result, Federica and I have been trying to understand this, is why there's this decrease in cohabit to married. And this is, if you have any suggestion, we're trying to understand. We've tried to tease out the data all over, and we cannot really find why. Instead of looking at total individual income, which includes all sorts of income coming from transfers, from capital income, so on and so forth, let's focus on labor market. So this is work income, and this is very big. So let me just show you the table, and then I'll focus, because it's so that I'm going to have, let's focus, this is women, okay, this part. And when I say no, it means I'm not controlling for hours, for effort. And when I say yes here, I'm controlling for how many hours women are working. And I'm looking at their work income. So even when I do not control for hours or effort, or I control for hours, in both cases, there's a very large drop of work income for women when they enter marriage, either via single to married, or interestingly, a huge drop when they move from cohabit to married. So the moment they go into marriage after cohabit, their income, work income drops. So it's even after controlling for hours. And this is a little bit the summary for men. There's not such a huge drop. And again, this is the puzzle. We don't know why. We have to figure this. There's this drop in cohabit to marry in work income. We don't understand what's going on in here. But for women, it's a very, very clear, as expected, result. I do this depending on their attachment. So what am I doing here? These two columns are exactly the ones you saw before, okay? So this is just women controlling for the hours they work, how much their work income changes. Now what I want to look at is, does it matter whether I pull all women regardless whether they're working or not? So I have some zeros. Does it matter whether I really look at women who were working to start with and they disappear from the labor market, some of them? Or does it matter if I only restrict my sample to people who work before and after and see whether even for those income drops? Okay, so these are three different exercises. So here is everybody. This is the one I showed you before. A clear drop from single to married, a super clear drop also from cohabit to married. Here, I'm restricting to people who were in the labor market before this transition. And in here, I'm restricted to people who were in the labor market before and are still in the labor market now. So no matter what I do, there's always a drop, okay? So no matter what I do, when women move to married, they are going to drop their income, even if they remain in the labor market. Of course, the drop is going to be much less because here I do not have the zeros of people just dropping to zero. But instead of having a minus 33, I have a minus 14, but there's still a drop. So that means there's a decrease in the attachment, or in case of controlling for work hours, even a decrease of the hourly wage that these women are getting. So they may be moving to other types of works. They may not be progressing in their career path in the same way that they would have potentially compared to other similar women that they didn't enter the marriage. Something is going on that their hourly wage is dropping, either because they are selecting other sectors upon their enter marriage, or because their career is not progressing in the same way. For men, this doesn't happen. Okay. Now let's look at hours. At this point, I was showing you total income. Okay. And so the thing is this related to hours? Is this related to hourly wage? So let me go and look at how many hours women and men work upon changing on the on marriage status. And then I'm going to look at whether this matters, also depending on whether children are present or not. So this is just hours, pure effort. Okay, so let's focus first in the first two columns. Here, this is level. So this is just the dummy of, are you married? Are you cohabiting compared to single? So the married women work fewer hours. And this doesn't, I mean, this is the same no matter what they did in the previous period. And then this is the change. When they move from single to married, women drop their hours, okay? They drop hour effort. And when they move from cohabit to married, they drop hours in the labor market. If I restrict this to people who work in both periods, before and after, it's still showing up in here. It's not showing up as much in here. So what we think is maybe what's going on in here, that's potentially an explanation, is some of these women, what may happen is that they may move from cohabit to married because they have a child. And if they have a child, you're observing this decrease in cohabit to married. But if they are staying still in the labor force because maybe they don't have the child, or in some cases they manage to stay, this change is not as noticeable. So this shift that we were observing in the drop in the labor, in the income and in the wages before, is also maybe related to the fact that this is related to a potentially child. For men, I'm sorry, very good. Did I go to the end? Oh no, I think I went till the end. I think I went to the last one, sorry. Let me go back to where I was. Okay, I was in here. Okay, so, okay, for men, no. For men, entering marriage always increases effort, okay? And not cohabit marriage, really the entering marriage increases their effort in the labor force. Now, what happens if you think about children? Well, if you think about children, then this group, even the gap widens the most. So the move from single to married in the presence of children, the drop is much larger than if there's no children. And the increase for men, if they have children from single to married, it's much higher. So for people who in our sample, we observe they have children. So at this point, we don't have that children are present there. We just observe that these people eventually, at some point in our sample, have children. So this is not a clean exercise completely. We're just saying people who have children are going to be the ones who more likely are going to increase effort at the time of the transition for men and decrease effort at the time of the transition for women. Okay, so children are clearly an important thing. And from single to cohabit, even the people who eventually have children also are going to decrease. So children seem to be one of the big drivers of effort for women, no matter what transition you observe. So you see the big difference in here. Summing up for hours, changes in hours work, dropping women, increasing men, similar shifts but smaller if we restrict the sample to those who work before and after. So the argument is that not driven by dropping out of the market only. It's also even women who stay in the labor force reduce effort. And these changes decrease women and increases in men are larger for those who are parents in the survey. So it's just, you know, the specialization somehow is exacerbated by the children. Let me show you some exploratory exercise, which is not kosher if you may. It's like a very weird one, but I'm just going to change the order of when things happen. I'm going to put a dependent variable that happens after what happens in the independent variable. So let me explain you. So let's imagine that I'm looking at the changes in hours in the effort, but now I want to look at what happened the previous year. Okay, so this is just a complete association. It's a nonsense relationship. Let's think about it as a correlation, if you may. So what I have in here is the same. Here I still have the change in hours of women when they move from single to married now. And in here, what I have in here will be how many hours they changed the previous year if this year they move from single to married. Okay, so it's lag. So what is lag is the dependent variable. it's a very strange thing, because in fact, my independent variable in this case, which is the marital change, happens after my dependent variable. So it's a nonsense relationship. Okay, so I'm just putting this as, let me see what is the correlation. Well, the correlation is such that, you know, there's not really an association of changes in effort the year before this woman got married. All the change really is happening the year the woman, it's correlated with the changes in the year she gets married. For men, there's already some change. So these men somehow are already in a steep increase. They are putting effort even before they are going to get married. So this is their increase in effort, thinking about the year before they got married. And this is the increase in effort the year they got married. So the question is, well, what do I think about that? First, I have to think this is exploratory and maybe nonsense. But suggestively, it may tell me that these men are already somehow in a steep incline, and they may be already specializing, or they may be already more attractive. So women are convinced that they're going to get married to them because the effort is changing before. Okay. So if women increase effort the year before and a bit men when entering the union, does this make a difference in terms of their income? Okay, so that's what I just told you. Neither men nor women display much significant changes. A bit more hours work for women the year before when they go from single to cohabiting, so that they are getting more income to be able to move out of their parental home, and minimal increases in hours for men that move from single to any union. So getting ready to move, more attractive. What about the same, but in work income? If I do the same in work income, let me just show you the differences. If I look at what happens for work income, men, the year before, are already increasing their earnings if they are going to either move with somebody and cohabit, or they are going to get married completely out of singlehood. No changes in cohabit to married, but the effort is there. So the thing is, well, are they getting ready? Are they selected? And these people, are they more attractive as partners? Are these women more convinced that they should choose and select those guys? Or this is already an initial specialization? And so that's a little bit the question mark that I said it's hard to tease out. So women, we observe smaller decreases in work income the year before marriage for those who are single, consistent on the fact that most people drop really happens at marriage. There's hardly anything happens the year before is when you marry. And from single to cohabitation, no changes in work income the year before. For men, it's positive income changes for men who start as single, especially those who marry rather than cohabit. So they are maybe on a positive income trajectory, they are getting ready or more attractive. Okay. And then we have our puzzling thing that we don't understand. What happens to the men that move from cohabitation to marry? Why do they drop a little bit the income? If anybody has a suggestion, we are welcome. So let me wrap up. So married women specialize, married couples specialize more than cohabitants. So the idea of specialization makes sense. Women or income decreases with marriage, whereas the total adult equivalent household increases. So they compensate their own decrease in income with the fact they are moving to a better adult equivalent household income. Changes in hours, large drop for women and increases for men, and even more if the children are present. No significant gain in household income when individuals move from cohabitation to marriage, and yes, in adult equivalent. Then changes in total household income from single to cohabitant married are very small in Europe, and especially in those that are low prevalent. There's hardly anything, or if anything, actually a drop. So one reason is maybe many people are living with parents before. So one thing we want to look at is the composition of where people are moving out from into. And then in terms of timing, suggestive of this exploratory evidence seems to be there's a bit before moving together of an increase in effort. Married women seem to decrease effort only around the time of the marriage. Cross-country differences that we have seen, and they are related to this prevalence, is that labor division is weaker in Northern Europe than in Southern Europe. And why controlling 4 hours of work reduces gender gaps in some countries more than others may be related to more or less selection at that point, because, you know, cohabitation was very low in these countries. So that's why we want to compare this now with the more recent data to see if this is a big difference in terms of the cross-country differences. There may be more occupational discrimination in some countries than others for women, or there may be differences in who's cohabiting in those countries. So what do we want to plan to do? Well, look at more recent data. We want to analyze also this of the number of children around the transition, not in overall, because we want to try to understand how much they account for this difference. We want to look at the educational gradient of some of these things, and we want to add country-specific labor market characteristics.